At a high school class reunion several years ago, a classmate I'd not seen in more than 30 years asked what incidents or events had significantly impacted my life since we'd last been in contact. My answer surprised him and also surprised me a little, I think. I said that the June 15, 1920 lynching of 3 black circus workers in our hometown had tremendously influenced my life in ways both personal and political, and it continues to inform me as a writer. The impact of those horrific murders has given rise to discussions on race and racism throughout this region of the country, and I've been privileged to participate in many of them, like this. They've been life-changing, allowing me to see and feel racism from the perspective of those most affected by it in ways I, as a person of privilege, couldn't have perceived prior to the 2000 republication of the lynchings in Duluth. On talk radio, much of which in my view is the bane of our culture, eliminating any possibility of civil discourse, I've heard comments like, slavery ended almost 150 years ago, so just get over it, you weren't victims. While it's true that descendants of slaves were not slaves themselves, victimization continues well beyond the era of slavery. Does the phrase 40 acres and a mule resonate with anyone today? Why do you suppose has Spike Lee named his film production company 40 Acres and a Mule Filmworks? Many of those present here today may not know that at the conclusion of the Civil War, freed slaves in 3 states were promised 40 acres of land and an army mule. These wound up being confiscated following the assassination of President Lincoln. Mistrust of government by slaves and descendants of slaves received a huge boost by this failed promise. Back in the 1960s, civil rights activists tried suing the federal government for interest on the 1865 promise of 40 acres and a mule, an amount estimated at about $500 million. And naturally, the suit was dismissed. Lest you think contemporary African Americans have no connection with slavery, I met a gentleman here several years ago who knew his great-grandmother, who had been a slave as a little girl. The slavery issue is not that far removed when people alive today knew former slaves. Through my new friends, I came to see the subtle and overt racism that I would never have noticed. For example, an everyday act, such as purchasing gasoline and a soft drink at the neighborhood convenience store, may be different for persons of color than for Caucasians. Quite often, the store clerk, not wishing direct contact with the customer, will slide change back to persons of color rather than handing it to them, exchanges I never consciously observed before. Or take the case of the 15-year-old sophomore from Stillwater High School, who in 2004 was stopped by police 37 times during the months of September and October. He was viewed suspiciously by residents and police for being present in areas where black persons rarely been seen. This boy was traveling on foot on his way to or from school or heading to his part-time job. I suppose it's possible a white kid could have had similar encounters, but it's just hugely doubtful. It would have taken 37 episodes for locals to get the message. I recall the late Jim Griffin, who at the time of his retirement was the highest-ranking African-American police officer in Minnesota and deputy chief in St. Paul, was also the past president of the city's school board, told me about the afternoon during his 80th year when he, his 82-year-old wife and grandson, driving in a northern Twin Cities suburb, were stopped by an officer because of a faulty taillight on their car. As Jim reached for his identification, he noticed 2 other squad cars pull alongside his vehicle. And as a former cop, he knew exactly what had happened. The officer who stopped the car of this old couple had called for backup support. I'd always thought my knowledge of American history was at least passable, but my awareness had inevitably precluded the stories of minorities and even some of the legislation that impacts them. In Bemidji, an Ojibwa woman spoke of her 100% Ojibwa granddaughter, who because of an early 1940s act of Congress is not considered a Native person and is thus not entitled to benefits accorded Native peoples. Back then, the United States Congress decreed that Native people must meet a blood quota before they could be enrolled in a tribe. The blood quota is set at 1/4. This doesn't merely mean that a person may be 1/4 Ojibwa, for example, but rather that the quarter that is Ojibwa must come from a specific band of that tribe, that is from either something like the Fond du Lac or Red Lake bands. But due to generations of intermarrying among Native peoples, the woman's granddaughter does not meet the 1/4 specification with any band, thus she is not officially a Native person. The woman said that many bands are so small they must marry outside their band to avoid passing on recessive genes. She concluded her remarks with, "What European invaders tried to do nearly 300 years ago to achieve the elimination of our people is now beginning to come to pass, and almost nobody knows about it." Until she spoke, I was one of the many who didn't know. Perhaps America will never be truly colorblind. Prejudices built over centuries may be difficult to overcome. But in seminars on race and community that I have attended, I've encountered men and women of goodwill who don't find the task daunting. They esteem the worth of all people, quietly, steadily working toward the betterment of our community with little or no recognition. There's no self-aggrandizement built into their motivations. They're simply people doing the right thing, and in many cases, they're going the extra mile. I'm thinking of the Clayton Jackson McGee Committee in Duluth, with dozens of dedicated volunteers who regularly met for 3 years to raise funds for the establishment of a moving memorial to the lynching victims in that city, and who also created a curriculum available online to any teacher who desires access to information for his or her classroom. Nearly 8 years after the formation of that committee, members still organize an annual march from the former Duluth City Jail to the memorial site to commemorate the victims and the healing of racism in the city. So successful have been their efforts that the committee is frequently consulted by other communities seeking their own memorials for those victimized by racial injustice. What I've learned from the aftermath of a terrible tragedy is that there are persons of boundless energy and integrity who work to make communities stronger and better. My involvement with them, made possible only because I documented the Duluth lynchings, has enriched my life, broken through my long-held cynicism, teaching me that people of goodwill matter and make a difference. And yet, there remains a caveat. Healing, acknowledgement, and apology are sometimes refused, rejected. Anger still persists in Duluth and has been articulated by Heidi Bach-Hansen, one of the founders of the Clayton Jackson McGee Committee. And in a recent email, she said this to me: "I've continued to be amazed at how seriously an event like the lynching so persistently reflects who we are and affects who we are. Fear of outsiders is everywhere in the world, but it is uniquely cast here, I think. It's very weird to watch it play out in the grocery store or listen to the undercover tension and rage in the voice of a lady getting a permanent when she talks about, quote, those people coming here, end of quote." Finally, however, the story of the Duluth lynchings shows us that if racism can be fostered by a lie, it can be eliminated by the truth, which, according to the biblical imperative, we shall know the truth, and the truth shall make us free. Thank you, and I'd be happy to entertain questions.